We've lost more warfighters to suicide than combat since the beginning of the Afghanistan war. You've heard of PTSD and burnout, but what if the real cause of the mental health decline in some of our most elite warfighters is something we're not even measuring? Today, we'll be unpacking one of the most misunderstood threats in military and tactical environments, blast-related traumatic brain injury, or bTBI. For decades, we've accepted that warfighters have been exposed to blast, from World War II naval ship gunfirers to modern-day special warfare operators using explosive demolitions or artillery tank crew. But what if the most dangerous injuries are the ones you can't see, the ones you don't always feel, and they don't present obvious symptoms until it's too late? Blast exposure causes brain damage, suicide, and death, and it's destroying veterans and their families. In September last year, the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide called for Defence to better understand and mitigate the impact of repetitive low-level blast exposure on brain processes. This episode brings together three unique perspectives. From the operator, I'll be talking about what blast exposure feels like in real life, how much blast defence personnel are routinely exposed to, and the devastating long-term effects. From the scientist perspective, biomedical scientist Ed Sorich will be unpacking what is actually going on in the brain at the cellular and molecular level after a blast, new frameworks for classifying TBI, and emerging biomarkers for TBI diagnosis and prognosis. And from the researcher perspective, with a background in defence science, Dr. Tim Doyle will unpack how blast affects cognitive and physical function and how research should be conducted to truly understand and address the problem. We'll also challenge some deeply held assumptions and ask the following questions. Is the main cause of the suicide pandemic among special forces and frontline personnel PTSD and burnout, or is it undiagnosed brain trauma? Can we actually measure brain damage? And are our current systems and recent guidance failing the people they're supposed to protect, or can we do better? In addition to challenging assumptions, we'll explore emerging solutions from novel biomarkers, next-generation wearable sensors, cutting-edge cognitive assessment tests, and AI-driven platforms that can help reshape how we detect, manage, and ultimately prevent blast-related TBI. If you care about protecting brains, preserving performance and operational capability, and making smarter operational decisions, you need to hear this conversation. Today, I'm here with Dr. Tim Doyle and biomedical scientist Ed Sorich. Thank you both for joining me. Tim, we actually met a few years back when my company started working out of the Macquarie University incubator. But for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you give us a background of yourself, your history with defence, and being a researcher at Macquarie University?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for the invite too. So I've been at Macquarie University nearly 10 years. I describe myself broadly as a physical performance and biomechanist scientist. And before Macquarie University, I was at the Defence Science Technology Group, or DSTO as they were known then, for 5 years. And in that time, I was mainly involved with physical employment standards, so determining what the requirements are for undertaking different job roles. But in that role, I got to experience a range of the different trades within the ADF and got exposed to special forces operators, most of the Army roles and other Navy and Air Force jobs as well. Part of my time there, I was aware of research that was being done around blast exposure. So, for example, some of the blast gauges that they use to profile what a blast wave looked like during breaching, for example, to understand where the best places and worst places were to stand for a team that was breaching a facility. The work that I've done most recently in the last 10 years since I left defence has maintained a military and emergency services focus. So looking at what it takes to undertake those physically demanding roles, how best to select people for those roles, and also the best analysis techniques, and using really fast-paced moving technology to get out into the field to measure these kinds of things, which is what we really need to do in this space as well.
Oh, thanks, Tim. And Ed, I actually recall Shane reaching out to you after we saw you on Channel 9 News regarding some of your innovations in TBI diagnosis and prognosis. We actually ended up working together on separate but related Defence Innovation Hub projects. So can you share with us a little bit about yourself and the work you do as an innovator and biomedical scientist?
Sure. Thanks again for the invitation. Also, I'm a qualified biomedical scientist. I started in pure research into cancer space. So, in a sense, really understanding what hypothesis meant, what it meant to actually prove that robustly, and to then publish. And I think that's an important thing around the TBI space because there's a lot of claims being made, and certainly the science is still a little bit missing in a lot of areas. So, transition through that, looked at functional pathology in particular, why particular pathologies happened, looking specifically at markers around that, developing profiles, looking at that as well. And in a sense, I think looking at functional pathology, if that's the correct term, looking at the mechanism of the pathology, what directly we should be measuring, and more so giving a treatment around that potentially as well. So TBI came across my desk several years ago. And at that point, it was really a sporting thing, right? So we were looking at what was happening in the US in particular with the NFL. And we were a little bit lagging in Australia. So I got myself on a plane, went to the US, saw that the NFL and General Electric were sponsoring 12 groups. And one of those groups were looking at specifically at a molecule or a particular biomedical marker that looked at the mechanism of injury. So that fit the purpose of my mantra, looking at mechanism of injury. And then now moving forward with that, commercializing that, and marrying it to a point-of-care device to bring the technology or the diagnosis to the patient.
Thanks, Ed. That was very insightful. For those that don't know me, my name's Daniel, co-founder and CEO of Invicta Prospects Group. I actually joined the Navy when I was 17 as an electronics technician, and I was exposed to blast in that role as a weapon system maintainer and operator, operating the 30mm cannon on the mine hunters. But in my early 20s, I became a clearance diver. Again, another job that's exposed to blast. So we used a lot of demolitions, both on land and underwater, and operated a number of different weapon systems. But it was in my late 20s that I ended up being employed as a clearance diver in a special operations unit, the Tactical Assault Group, which is a hostage recovery and counterterrorism unit. And that's when I guess myself personally was exposed to the most amount of blast on a routine basis. And as typical for many counterterrorism roles and tactical units around the world for military and law enforcement, we often train at a very high tempo. And during that tempo, we would conduct, for example, a week of diving, a week of breaching, a week of parachuting, and then every so often we'd bring it all together in like a full mission profile. But on a typical breaching week, we'd be in an urban environment. These are training environments that are often made of concrete, internal walls of concrete, external walls of concrete, and we'd conduct several external breaches per day. Again, several more internal breaches, breaching internal doors through hallways, and then doing that multiple days in a row. And that cumulative load starts to take an impact. And when I think back about the first time I was exposed to blast, it feels exhilarating. It's like a bit of a rush. It hits you, and you notice something there. But over time, I think you just become inoculated to it. You get used to it. But what we would often see, and this is sort of anecdotal for myself and the guys I would work with, after a week of breaching, you would have symptoms that you wouldn't often attribute to breaching. So, you might have some headaches, some sleep disruption, you're not feeling as well, maybe a bit more irritated, right? And I've no doubt now that those heavy breaching weeks were having an impact on our brains. And having spoken with, hundreds of operators all around the world from all generations, operators from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, what we see is there's definitely a commonality in the culture. We want to train hard. We want to train fast. We want to be the best that we can be. But the safety mechanisms and protocols that were in place were really established on misapplied science. So there is a K-means formula that's used for explosive breaching to determine the minimum safe distance. And this is a formula that's used for most Western militaries. That formula is actually derived to assess structural damage on buildings, but typically in an open field environment. It doesn't account for the reflections in a complex environment or an urban environment, and it doesn't necessarily count for how the blast wave propagates and behaves in a close environment, because blast waves sort of in that near field happens to behave differently than when you're very far away, right? And so these safety protocols, they aren't fit for purpose. And so, we would often predict that we might be exposed to, 1 or 2 psi standing at X distance from a breaching charge. That might be, 3 or 4 meters. In reality, that's calculating an incident pressure wave in an open field environment. The reflected pressures can sometimes be orders of magnitude higher than the incident wave. And so we are not really understanding, what we've exposed our operators to, and it's far higher than we originally thought. Again, and when I think back to the training that we were conducting in those units, things were not always precise. Many times we were not using prefabricated charges. So this means that the explosive charges that we were building during training and operations were effectively built by the operator under intense time pressure. So you might have a few minutes to build a few internal and external door charges. So we're getting det cord, primer sheet, plastic explosives, different chemical compounds. Now, if we're using a certain amount of explosive to breach an external door, I'm not sitting there and getting the scale and precisely measuring 100 grams of this explosive and 2 meters of det cord. It's all sort of by feel. And so there is going to be a variance between the net explosive weight of the charge between the operators that build them. Again, someone who's got quite a long arm span, their 4 meters is, 1, 2, 3, 4, compared to a shorter operator who might use the same technique, but that distance and the amount of explosive in there is going to vary. And then even for units around the world that we've spoken to that use prefabricated charges, we still have this issue of tactical aggressiveness. And so there's these safe distances and these formulas that we use that say, you have to stand 4.2 meters away from a charge or whatever the distance might be. Place the charge on the door, and as we're stepping back, when you get the squeeze on the shoulder from your supervisor, you're going to detonate that charge. Sometimes you're 3 meters away when you should have been 4.5 meters away per the safety guidance, right? And that comes down to this culture of tactical aggressiveness. You want the element of surprise. As soon as you've made the breach, you want to be in that room as quick as possible, engaging the enemy. And I guess it's a combination of these cultures, these misapplied science, and these imperfect measures that have really put, in particular, special forces operators at risk over the past 20 years. And we're seeing these increasing number of mental health issues in these communities of military personnel that are exposed to blast, and they're getting diagnosed with PTSD. But I believe that there's a far higher prevalence of an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury, with blast being the cause. And so when we look at who's actually exposed to blast in the military, it's not just special forces, even though special forces do expose themselves to quite a large volume of repetitive low-level blast. There's infantry, there's mortarmen, artillery, tank crew, naval gunfirers. There's tactical roles in the Air Force. And so all of these roles, whether they're firing shoulder-mounted weapons, rocket launchers, demolitions, these blast waves are causing damage. And right now, we are not doing enough to measure and monitor and mitigate those risks, and we can certainly be doing more. And so after being exposed to blast in the military, my business partner and I, we saw the effects firsthand. We've seen guys fall off the rails and their mental health decline. And these are really resilient guys who had no sort of reason that we could see why they should be falling apart mentally. Some of these guys hadn't deployed or hadn't seen combat, but some of them had. But the common denominator was this high exposure to blast. And when you've been on the receiving end of phone calls past midnight, and you've got your mates telling you they're going to jump off the roof of a building or they're going to blast themselves with a shotgun, we knew something had to be done. And that's why my business partner and I, we discharged from the ADF in 2019 to really solve this issue, as well as a number of other safety and performance issues that we saw whilst we were serving. I guess my business partner and I, we were probably the first generation of guys to join the military and grow up with computer systems and technology. So many of our supervisors that were, perhaps a decade older than us, didn't grow up with technology and perhaps were a little bit more technophobic than what we were. And, being curious and doing the research and also having an engineering background, albeit electronics engineering, we started to realize that, hang on a sec, we can use technology here to start to mitigate the risks of blast. We thought if we can measure the cause of the blast and how much pressure they've been exposed to, and we had measurements that could be used in terms of the cognitive performance decline or measure the damage to the brain. And if we understood the context, we could use regression analysis, mathematics, science, research, as well as machine learning and artificial intelligence to correlate the relationship between the cause and effect and provide personalized and individualized recommendations to soldiers on the front line to prevent the injuries before they occur. But when it comes to PTSD and TBI, we know that they have many common symptoms: anxiety, depression, sleep issues, fatigue, anger management issues, cognitive performance decline. And, my hypothesis and anecdotally, we just believe that there is an underdiagnosis of TBI in defence. And we've got to remember that TBI is a physical injury. PTSD is a psychological injury. And if you have a broken leg, you can't talk your way through a broken leg. So for somebody with a traumatic brain injury, no amount of therapy or seeing a psychologist is going to help. It's a physical injury, requires a different diagnosis and a different treatment. And I think that the missing the diagnosis or not diagnosing an underlying TBI, whether or not there is PTSD, there could be, there might not be, but if you don't diagnose that TBI and you're giving them the wrong treatment, I think that's exacerbating the mental health issues. It's making the mental health symptoms even worse, and sadly, it's resulting in suicide. In a very short period after I discharged, we lost three members of our unit to suicide, and that's just three. That's the three guys who have families. Two of them, had children, and this is extremely sad. But it's not just the guys that we've lost. More than 80% of my former unit have discharged due to poor mental health. And more than half that I know of have attempted suicide. And so these statistics are startling, and something needs to be done. So I guess we now know with the research and connecting the dots and looking at what's going on, we know that blast exposure causes TBI. And so I guess I'd like to, put it to the experts, Tim and Ed, and what actually happens when somebody is exposed to blast, even at low levels?
Well, I mean, it's complicated, but it's not at the same time. We know that some force is initiated by the blast itself, and there's an electromagnetic component to that. So that electromagnetic component is really that subatomic, subcellular shearing force that's causing something at a level that we obviously physically can't see. On top of that is the rotational force that is also applied. So you've got two forces, one literally going through the cell, and the other on a grander tissue scale, causing some grander damage. They're all culminating ultimately in inflammation, but prior to inflammation, you've got a response which is basically oxidative stress. So you've got this initiation of damage, you've got this overlying body response as a protective mechanism, and then ultimately that downstream becomes inflammation. So everyone talks about this inflammation and saying, everything is in pathology is basically around inflammation. What we now understand is that we can measure more so the mechanism at the beginning of that process rather than waiting for the inflammation. We can capture it early, we can personalize it, and then we can actually apply the treatment that's specific to that particular patient. So the pathology itself is complicated, but I think the mechanism whereby we treat it really isn't that complicated.
Is there a difference between what we see with impact traumatic brain injury and blast-related or blast-induced traumatic brain injury at the cellular or molecular level?
Yeah, there is. I think, there's a school obviously around the CT school, and CT that's found in warfighters is different than what they're finding in sports people. Does that actually tell us that there's a difference of the initial TBI? Probably not. I would suggest that the pathology is quite similar. I would think that the downstream result is a little bit different, and that's again dependent on the initial force and how much exposure they've actually got. So I would argue that the military personnel is exposed to a higher level of injury initially as opposed to the footballer, and hence maybe why we've got that difference in CTE. But the initial damage, be it being falling off your scooter, blast related, is quite similar. And do we really have to understand that there's a difference at those points? Probably not. What we have to understand is a TBI is a TBI, and we're actually treated that way when the patient turns up.
So I guess what we're sort of saying in layman's terms is that if there's any sort of brain injury, initially there's going to be a neuroinflammation response, and that's typically a protective measure that the body's doing. And so whether that's from blast or from a head knock, we're going to see inflammation that we can measure, and that is an early indication of the downstream effects, which will be the distinct blast-related traumatic brain injury or the distinct CTE that we see in sports athletes, which we know that they are distinct injuries and they're separate, and we want to make sure that there is separate studies done because the long-term effects are different. But we know that when we look at the initial injury and the initial response, they're actually quite similar. We see this inflammatory response.
Yeah, correct.
And so I think when we look at sort of mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injury, I think there's been a lot of advancements in this space. And actually, Ed, you and I attended a conference recently for the launch of a publication for a new framework for classifying TBI. And so I think it's good to see that the world is changing about how we look at TBI, because we now know that mild TBI doesn't mean it's not as bad. You can have a mild traumatic brain injury that still has devastating effects, right? And so this new framework that they're looking at is actually called the CBI-M framework, which is a clinical biomarker imaging modifiers framework. I guess, Ed, did you have any insights or anything you'd like to share from this new publication?
I'm just thinking as you speak there. So one of those things that got highlighted in that particular presentation or that conference was that the classification, similar to cancer, there's no mild through to severe cancer, right? That was the statement that was actually made. When in essence there actually is. So the difference between levels of cancer are dependent on biomarkers that actually pick up those variations in level. So hence TBI is in the same realm, right? So there is grades of TBI, and we can actually measure that. Even with mild TBI, there's different grades of TBI. So we finally got biomarkers that can actually quantify that level. I think the message from that conference was that, and it was basically so much as to say, let's get rid of the word mild because that cheapens, for lack of a better word, our understanding or appreciation of a mild type, of a low-grade TBI. So I think that is the thing that I took away from it was, yeah, we can put it in the same camp, but then again, we can't wash our hands of it and say that all TBIs are the same because they're not.
No, exactly. And I think just using that CBIM framework just to provide an example, and I think this is the way of the future in terms of ongoing research and being able to classify traumatic brain injuries. For the clinical measurement, they use as an example the Glasgow Coma Scale. So, for example, you could give somebody a GCS score of 14 with biomarkers. They use GFAP as an example, but I think we could use different markers because not all brain injuries have a brain bleed. And so I think we can look at maybe, is there an inflammation marker? And we know that there is inflammation markers. So how inflamed is the brain? Has the brain suffered a brain bleed? And then with imaging, we can see things on images that we don't pick up necessarily in a biomarker or from a symptomology test, right? So, do they have hemorrhage or a contusion, swelling? So these are different things that we can measure. And then the modifiers, I think we know that with two individuals with the same injury, depending on who they are and their current state of health will determine how they recover from that. So the modifiers that they were looking at, as an example, age, sex, weight, and pre-existing conditions. So, a 32-year-old male with no prior injuries and who's at a healthy weight range is going to have a different recovery rate from an elderly person who perhaps has diabetes and is overweight, right? And so I think this CBIM framework is something that's interesting and something that we'll be including in our further research that we do with US DoD and hopefully the ADF when the time's right. A question for both of you. I think the school of thought was many years ago that we couldn't really measure TBI until somebody had passed away, and we conduct an autopsy and we're looking for the tau protein. But with advancements in technology and things that we're doing, can we actually measure TBI today, or can we measure leading indicators of TBI?
You mean CTE, mate? Did you mean CTE?
Yeah, CTE, TBI.
Yeah. So, without a doubt. So things are moving towards, as we get smarter with biomarkers, we're moving towards something that we can measure somebody while they're alive with CTE. I know that with some of the studies that we did when we actually stained CT positive brain tissue, that we did show our biomarkers lighting up that tissue. Now, was that a biomarker for CTE? What I would say is that the TBI actually led to that pathology. So maybe there was more, we were measuring the mechanism of the end pathology rather than measuring the CTE. But the beauty of that was that we were clearly defining or showing that there was a link between the two. So if we don't have a CT biomarker per se, if we've got a TBI biomarker, we can then say, you've definitely got a TBI or you don't. And then we can actually say, we're not going to allow you to go back into activity until that's recovered to a point that's not going to overlay into further injury. And that's a CTE skill, right? Serial subconcussions lead to CTE. There is no one TBI leading to a CTE. That has never been shown or even argued. So if we can actually capture, triage, and get that patient into the right framework, it shouldn't lead to CT anyway. So why do we really need a CT biomarker is what I'm saying.
And probably I'll just add that and this is fairly universal for physical performance research, is nowadays we can measure almost anything that we want to measure. When I first started doing this, which was, a couple of decades ago, we were always limited whether we wanted to measure someone's power or strength. Now we're talking about, blood biomarkers and indicators of TBI. In the past, we've always been limited to being able to measure only a very few things. Nowadays, pretty much whatever we want to measure, we can measure. And we can measure that in the field in real time. And then with the analysis techniques that are continue to advance really quickly, we're also able to analyze those results and get actionable feedback that can be used on the ground almost immediately. But what we're missing in the TBI space is to know exactly which things that we need to measure, exactly how to analyze them, and exactly what those thresholds are at which, in a training environment, at least we could say to an operator, hey, that's enough for you today, take a rest, come back tomorrow or in 2 days or in 3 days, whenever the time frame might be. In an actual mission, that might be a bit different because there's obviously mission objectives that probably can't be changed, depending on someone's physical status, but potentially you could change the makeup of the team. So that's where we are at the moment, I think, with TBI research, is we can measure what we need to measure, but we're not sure yet what it is that we need to measure and what the thresholds are that we need to take action at.
I guess to me, it sounds like, there are a variety of things we can measure. So we could measure the symptoms of the TBI, and there's novel ways to measure the inflammation, the leading indicators of TBI and TBI itself. And so we've got things like cognitive assessment tests, oculography, which measure the fine motor movements in the eyes, imaging such as MRI, CT scans, and then biomarkers. And so I guess one of the things I wanted to touch on is when we look at other disciplines, in particular toxicology, right? And I like to apply best practice from different disciplines to solve problems, because I guess principally they're solving the same problem. It's just in a different field. And so when I look at how safe measurements are in toxicology, and I'll use alcohol as an analogy or an example, we really want to set the safe limit on the physiological side, not on the cause side. And so, for example, if blast exposure was like drinking alcohol, right? The last thing we want to say is that, we've got a 4-beer limit. You can only have 4 beers in whatever period of time, and you're safe to drive. Now, we all know that, the three of us here, we can have 4 beers over 2 hours, and we blow into a breathalyzer, and there's every chance that 1 or 2 of us are under the limit and one of us is over the limit, right? And looking at that and then seeing what's happening again with the safety guidance and publications coming out from the US and NATO, I think this shows that we need to do better. And we have some interim guidance from the US, which is no individual exposure should exceed a peak overpressure of 4 psi. And I think that's an interesting number, the 4 psi, and I think unpacking that a little bit, I mean, do you guys know where that 4 psi threshold actually comes from or is derived from?
Wow. I mean, it was interesting because, the blast gauges have been around for a while now and measuring it. And it was a great move, right? By trying to put a number on something and qualifying that as the cutoff, which is a little bit oversimplistic because we know that the level of force does not correlate to the level of injury. So a couple of years ago at a conference in the US, medical military conference, this announcement was made around 4 psi. Now, you could have heard a pin drop in the room because there was researchers in that room that have been in that space for multiple years. All of a sudden, we're being told that 4 psi was the level. Prior to that, we had levels of, 7, 8, 9 as being an acceptable level, and then even lower than that. So they came to this number. And at that conference, it was clarified that the 4 psi basically was made the number because that correlated most likely to eardrums being blown out. Now, again, great step forward in a sense if you want to protect, operators' hearing in the long term, but where does that relate to actual TBI injury? It doesn't, right? So again, they're applying a number that doesn't really correlate. And the problem with that is we spent a lot of money and a lot of time getting to that particular point, and now we put a brick wall up to actually say 4 psi is the number. It's just muddied the waters irrevocably.
I think so. And look, I think it's good to have a line in the sand and somewhere to start. But again, learning from toxicology, we know that we need to have a measurement on the physiological side. Individualized medicine seems to be the way of the future, and we think that we've got the tools and the team to do that research and make that happen. There's also some additional guidance, I believe that's coming out or will be out soon, which is 31.7 psi milliseconds of cumulative impulse in a 24-hour period. And again, I think that's a start, and I know there was some decent research with measuring cognitive performance decline within a 24-hour period, and so they knew that at a certain impulse, they could see a measurable decline in cognitive performance. And so I think, again, that's a bit better than setting a safe limit based on exposure to an unprotected eardrum. However, I think based on the data that I've seen and also looking at what correlates to performance decline or correlates to inflammation, I don't think enough is being done in terms of analysing the blast wave and finding out what actually correlates to the physiological effect. And I'm going to sort of break this down in layman's terms because I'd like, I guess, the people listening to understand what's going on. But if we set the peak pressure, just the peak overpressure, as a number that we're going to rely upon for safety guidance? Well, we could dive down to 200 meters, and we're exposed to an incredible amount of pressure. And if you dive down slowly and do it safely, you can hit at quite a high peak pressure when diving. It doesn't really have any impact or correlation on the brain. And we know a lot of deep sea divers are not having this, these mental health declines or suicide issues, right? So peak overpressure as a single number to me just doesn't make sense. Impulse as well. Again, I think it's a better measurement. So impulse, when we look at a blast wave, we look at an increase in pressure. We then see that pressure decline, sometimes below ambient, and so you'll have a negative part of the wave, and then it will return to baseline. That's an idealized blast. Often we have these peaks and troughs and reflections, but the impulse is the area under the curve of the wave. And again, it doesn't really make sense to me because different chemical compositions, when it comes to blast, they will have a far more rapid increase in pressure compared to other chemical compounds. And again, going back to my experience diving and sort of understanding of engineering and mathematics, if we dive safely at a sort of slow rate of descent and a slow rate of ascent, and we stay at the bottom, at a certain depth for a period of time, we actually have quite a large impulse. So we are exposed to a large amount of pressure for a long amount of time. And so again, we see divers not having these brain injuries, these civilian and commercial divers. And so impulse, again, to me, doesn't seem like the right measurement. And so my hypothesis and what I think is going on and looking at the data that we've done and analysed commercially is I think it's actually got more to do with the rate of change between the ambient and peak pressure, as well as the amount of change from the ambient to peak. And I think a ratio of those numbers is going to correlate far better to a decline in cognitive performance and a physiological response than impulse or TBI, impulse or peak overpressure. And so again, I think impulse, loosely correlated, but again, you give somebody a pressure gauge that's been diving, you're going to think, oh wow, this is really, really bad. They've hit this huge impulse, and they're perfectly safe. So it's about how aggressive is that blast wave and that force actually hitting the operator, and how intense is that blast wave. I think they're the things that we need to be looking at. But I guess, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the kind of thing you're describing is pretty typical for sports injury analysis as well. And I guess what we're always looking for is that one number. So, people can, come up with 4 PSI, for example. That's a number. And while at the time it might have been an okay number based on the information that was available, at least it indicates that people are thinking about it moving in the right direction. You look at other kinds of injuries, sports injuries, for example. We look at ACL and hamstring injuries, and people have talked about Q angles and acute chronic workload ratios and hamstring to quadricep strength and intercondylar notch widths and so forth, all as potential indicators and predictors of injury. And what it tells you is that any injury, and we're talking about an injury here, is more than likely multifactorial, and you've touched on it already a little bit, but it's also personalized. And so it's all these things need to be investigated. We need to understand the impact of each of those on a group as a whole, but then individually as well. And so, we're at the point, I think, with TBI injuries or TB or traumatic brain injuries, where we've been with many other physical injuries before. And so it's probably a good indication that we're at least moving in the right direction. Yes, we've still got a long way to go. And I think we also need to be looking a bit further upstream as well, because ideally when we want to act on someone or intervene on someone before they've got an injury. And this is always a holy grail of any kind of injury research. And we often go away now from talking about predicting injuries because it's almost impossible to accurately predict an injury. But what we can get better at is identifying the conditions under which an injury is likely to happen. And then if someone has been exposed too much to those conditions, then that might be a reason to, if we use a traffic light system, to put them under a yellow warning, or eventually a red. And so that's what we need to do now is really understand the impact of all those things that you just mentioned there, the interplay of them, and then how that interacts on individuals.
Certainly, I think that's interesting. And again, learning from other disciplines, right? We talk about toxicology, we talk about sports. I guess if you were to conduct a study, or if you were the lead researcher on a study for TBI, I mean, how would you think that the study should be structured? And what can we learn from sports research or other disciplines and areas that you've worked with?
Yeah, sure. So one of the first things that you need to know about an injury is what the exposure rates are for individuals that are likely to experience an injury, and what the incident rates are. And we've mentioned that already a little bit today. Probably there's an underdiagnosis of people that are getting traumatic brain injuries, through blast exposure, potentially. And I'll draw another sports analogy here because sometimes it makes it easier to connect with. If you think about the football codes, and often we do think about those collision sports when we're talking about TBIs. Often those head knocks occur during a tackle. In that tackle, typically you've got the ball carrier and the person doing the tackling, and those two people are exposed to a potential risk factor for getting a TBI, being a collision. The other players on the field are not, because they're not involved in that contact. But for someone in a team that's undertaking a breaching activity, for example, it's not just the person that sets the blast and triggers it. Everyone who's in that vicinity is going to be exposed to different degrees. And so that's one of the first things that we need to do is understand what the exposure rate is to the conditions that are likely to cause a TBI. What we can also do now through, blood biomarkers, for example, the different kind of measurements that we can do, oculography, which is spoken about, people's balance, concentration, and so forth, understand those that actually do have TBIs, because there'd be plenty of people, and you've mentioned this before, that would go home with a bit of a headache, being a little bit grumpy, and they'd sleep it off and go undiagnosed, even though that's almost certainly a TBI, which hasn't been written down on a paper to understand what the exposure rate is and what the incident rate is. And that'd be the first thing that needs to be done. So set up shop for a period of time during a breaching course, for example, where it's relatively controlled. You can measure how many breaches people are being exposed to. You can measure all those blast waves. You can measure their blood biomarkers, and all the things that you need to measure. You can measure, and that will help you to understand on a exposure rate number, say per 1,000 hours of blast exposure, for example, how many TBIs people are experiencing. Once you can start doing that, then you can help the decision makers to understand, hey, the rate of injury is much higher than you thought, because that's probably what we would find. And helping them to understand what that problem space is helps people to feel a bit more ownership of it. And so that's the first thing that needs to be done. Once you understand how many injuries are occurring, then try and understand what the mechanisms are that you can measure to indicate when people should be pulled back from that exposure rate. And that's why what I mean by when I say we should start looking more upstream, because we want to try and identify it before injuries happen and understand that the risk factors and the conditions under which people may experience a TBI.
No, certainly, and I think one of the issues with blast-related TBI, and what we see is that often the symptoms don't present for many years, and sometimes, people leave the military, they discharge, and it's not till 5 or 10 years afterwards that the degradation of their brain is starting to have an impact. And I guess what we see is veterans who have been out of the service for 5-10 years. They might not have handled explosives for 5 or 10 years, but during that period, there is this decline. anger management issues, relationship issues, divorces. All these things, I guess, compound to their circumstance. But what's really happening is they have this undiagnosed brain injury that hasn't been treated, hasn't been diagnosed, and everything else falls apart around them and just gets worse and worse and worse until the point where they attempt to take their own life or take their own life. And it's extremely sad. And you were mentioning before about, blood biomarkers and different biomarkers, which sort of leads me into my next point about some of these novel biomarkers that are out there. We know there's some blood-based biomarkers, and we've looked into a few, including your biomarkers, Ed. And I think one of the reasons why we chose to partner with GLIA Diagnostics and looking at your biomarkers, I think for us it was quite clear that the repetitive low-level blast exposure is subconcussive, and we don't believe that the routine blast exposure during training and operations is actually causing bleeds on the brain. So there are some blood-based biomarkers that actually measure proteins from brain bleeds. So what happens is, there's a severe head trauma, there's a bleed on the brain, the blood-brain barrier opens up, that blood is expelled, the blood-brain barrier shuts, and that blood, certain proteins in the blood is circulating throughout the system, and we can measure that. And I guess one of the issues that we have with that, again, is that we don't believe that the repetitive low-level blast exposure is causing brain bleeds. So I think it is a great diagnostic, but it's for a different type of injury. But the other thing is that that blood, that protein in the blood tends to be metabolized quite quickly. So after a few weeks, what we see is we retest the individual and the protein is no longer present in the measurement, and the assumption could be made that they are safe, when in actual fact that could take months or years for that brain to recover. What's actually happened is that the expelled blood has crossed the blood-brain barrier has shut, the brain is still injured, it's bruised, it's got the bleed, and it's going to take quite some time to heal. And we don't know if it's healed by doing that same test again. But when we look at the biomarkers that you've innovated and worked with, Ed, what I've seen in the data is that it's quite sensitive, not only the blast but head trauma, and it's a very sensitive measurement of neural inflammation. And what we see, and I think this is great for analysis and machine learning, is that everybody who's exposed to blast, with the measurements of your biomarkers, they have a consistent response. So there's almost this wave-like shape response, and what varies is the amplitude of the wave and the length of the wave. So consider the amplitude of the wave being the intensity of the injury or the inflammation, and the length is how long it takes that inflammation to return to baseline effectively, when they can return to duty or they're recovered. So that's my understanding and breaking it down in layman's terms. But what that allows us to do as a software company and with artificial intelligence and machine learning is that once we expose somebody to blast and we measure their neural inflammation with the biomarkers, we can then start to predict the intensity of their response and how long it's going to take them to recover. And I think this is where the gold standard of diagnosis and recovery is going to be, especially in that preventative space. But I guess, Ed, can you touch on your biomarkers and have I explained that well enough?
Yeah. No, excellent. So much to unpack, right? Even with what Tim was saying with the clinical studies. You want to be measuring lots of stuff, right? Absolutely. But how do we actually decipher that? How do we actually make sense of it? And that's been the problem with clinical studies up until now, I believe. So, with the ITAB study, for example, multiple measures were made. There's now a bank of data sitting somewhere. The resources have run out to analyze that data. So in a sense, we've achieved nothing via clinical studies.
Can I just ask a question? So with that ITAB study, is that the project that you worked on with the US DOD?
Yeah.
And can you tell us, who ran the project, which unit partook in it, which universities were involved? Can you just give us a bit of a rundown on that?
Yeah. I mean, I've got to say, in terms of novelty and changing the game, ITAB was probably up there. And that was a study that was completed in US Navy SEALs, special operators. It was the cohort. It was headed by Uniformed Services University and Yale University. So you had two leading universities who had been, pretty well established in the space, sort of running it. And it was designed pretty robustly. The problem with any clinical study is that first thing you learn in science is as soon as you introduce observation into a study, it becomes biased, right? So you want minimal hands-on in any clinical study. That's in its purest form, right? If you start adding layers to a particular clinical study, you're just going to make trouble for yourself later on because you have to analyze that data and then you're going to correlate it against the other measures you've actually got. So in a walk before you can run. So similar to what Tim said, we want to strip it all back. We want to do clinical study and or measure markers, which give us some level of exposure, some level of injury so that we can actually say, this is your triage pathway, this is you. As you move forward, absolutely. Can we tell how badly someone's concussed? For sure. Can we tell someone that they're going to be returning in a week as opposed to 3 weeks? Absolutely. But at this point, we still have to be clear there is no FDA-approved biomarker for concussion or TBI. So the protein biomarkers, which are heavily commercialized and promoted, great starting point, similar to the 4PSI in terms of the level of exposure that we were saying. It's a great starting point. We've got something. A predicate has been set, if I can use that term. So we now need a set of biomarkers which overcomes what you indicated. So after a period of time, the blood-brain barrier closes. Those biomarkers still remain peripheral in the peripheral bloodstream for a period of time. It's not to say that they're not there, but their half-life is so short that our measurement systems can't pick them up. So they still may be there, but we're not able to pick them up. What we find with our biomarkers, microRNA, that even after the blood-brain barrier closes, we still get that seeping into the peripheral bloodstream. So it's still there, it's still measurable, but they're more stable in that system as well. So we've got the presentation. We can measure mild versus non-presentation. We can tell someone how badly they're concussed via those biomarkers. More so, the game breaker is when we're able to serially measure over a recovery period those biomarkers at a level that is scientifically valid to determine when they're actually back to safety or when they're back to baseline. So that's a combination of biomarkers I think is important and similar, again, as the extension to the clinical study side to a degree, multimodal. So biomarkers are not the be-all and end-all. Anyone who sells you the fallacy that we've got a set of biomarkers and they're going to change the world hasn't happened, never has to this point in any pathology. So we've got to use those in combination. So I truly believe novel technologies such as the eye tracking, fantastic, dexterity, neurocognitive measures on computers, they all play a role. But looking at even the relationship that we've got, I think the benefit of what the Invicta product actually does is it takes those multiple measures and it actually makes sense of them and spits out a number. I think that is the solution that we are looking for, and that's what the market is actually requiring.
Certainly. I guess with that ITAB study, just touching on that, was that study ever completed, Ed?
The study was completed, and just as I say, there's now data banked, either Yale or Uniformed Services, that is now not accessible because of the fact that they run out of money, which sounds ridiculous because you would have thought they would have been factored into the initial study, right? That said, the claims that are now being made on the amount of money that's required to actually bank that or to analyze that bank data is crazy as well. If we were to access that data and we could do it for, tens of thousands as opposed to hundreds of thousands, we could very quickly analyze our data against the other gold standard data that people speak about in terms of the biomarkers, and we could move the ball forward significantly, leaving, the gap that GFAP and UCH has left. We can quickly fill that and progress the science very, very rapidly.
And so I guess with the GFAP and microRNA, looking at all these biomarkers, we can start to get a more holistic view of the damage to the brain, from brain bleeds to inflammation. Then we've got cognitive assessment tests like the Dana Brain Vital cognitive assessment test, which is very sensitive and cutting edge test that's being used by the US DoD. Again, we've got oculography, imaging, and I think that multimodal approach is really what we're looking for. And for TBI in general, but when it comes to blast rate of TBI, what are those early leading indicators? And I think really having a sensitive cognitive performance test and being able to correlate that with inflammation on the brain, I think that's the direction we need to go.
But I think if I can just jump in there, the performance part is critical, right? And Tim's alluded to that as well. You know, we should be following what other sports-related injuries have done, and performance is one of those indicators that they've used, be it downstream or early on, a baseline and then comparison thereafter. I think that's an important part because we are talking about elite athletes in the special operators. So why should we treat them any differently? We don't want to hold them back. We want to say that you still want to be fighting at that lethal level. But we want to be saying that we want to still keep you below the envelope, not only for your performance aspect, but for your long-term health and safety when you transition. So performance, I think, is a really word that isn't used enough when we actually are looking at TBI-based biomarkers.
Well, certainly, I think performance and capability go hand in hand. Well, I guess in terms of pushing the envelope and really, doing further research of these microRNA, Ed, is there anyone that we think can help, whether they're in the ADF or the US DoD, that can help release that data so that we can analyse it and publish the findings? Because I think that's critical in sort of moving this technology forward.
100%. I think that's the other frustration, right? And you felt that as well. So we go to the US and the US guys know we're doing something, but they don't actually know who's doing it. Similarly, when we actually speak to people here, I think we have a little bit more fluency in who's doing what in the US. But it's this, we'll stand back until the Americans do something, right? So we got to change, obviously, that tack. I truly believe that being an Australian-based company who has already worked with the ADF, that we should have representation or someone in the US actually banging on doors and actually gleaning that information for us. Short of that, where our sponsors was US SOCOM, so probably finding someone within US SOCOM who we can, promote or push to actually get that data for us.
Well, if you're listening to this and you're in the ADF or in the US DoD and you think you can help us get access to that data from Uniformed Services or Yale, please reach out to Ed. We'll have his contact details at the end of the podcast. But I think it's critically important we continue to study this neural inflammation and these biomarkers. Also wanted to touch on, Ed, just like us, you had a project that was funded by the Defence Innovation Hub here in Australia. Can you talk to us a little bit about that project and what happened?
Again, frustrating in a sense, very, very appreciative that, a little company like GLIA actually got a significant amount of funding from the ADF via the Innovation Hub. We successfully completed that project. We demonstrated to the ADF, including Joint Health Command. They gave the verbal sign-off on the day. They were very excited at what we actually demonstrated. With the change of government, departments changed. DIH no longer existed. And whoever worked in that realm previously was basically shown the door, which made little sense because, it was the same sort of government and the same organisation who was sponsoring it, be it in the DIH guys or in the new guys. So we were signed off. We were typically going to roll over. We were told we were going to roll over into phase 3 because we completed phase 2, but that didn't actually eventuate. So as such, we've hit the wall a little bit with the ADF, which I thought was a good relationship. And the intent of that was to hold the hand of the ADF, then go to the DoD and actually say in the US, we have a complete solution. Let's talk.
No, certainly. And I think, we had very similar experiences with the Defence Innovation Hub and we were awarded a phase 1 concept exploration project, and we actually gathered requirements for the Blast Buddy product and a few other products and innovations that we had. But, again, like yourself, when the hub was shut down, our project funding was cut. And despite over-delivering and getting great results and feedback from the ADF and being told that we were going to progress, that didn't happen. And I think, like yourself, Ed, Shane and I, we've invested literally our life savings into this life-saving technology. We put it all on the line. And I think when you're personally driven and you see people that are suffering the effects of TBI, when you're attending funerals and you see the children of your mates crying over their dead father's coffin, it's something that there's no amount of money in the world is going to stop us from pursuing this and solving this issue, because I don't want to see that again, not only for my friends, but even for the people in the community and people that I haven't met, because I know how devastating this is. And I think it's just at the end of the day, it's a shame that they shut the Defence Innovation Hub down. Obviously, the program wasn't a great success. They bled a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of success commercializing, but ultimately they were funding very important research and research that needs to continue to be funded. But I guess I'm going to put you on the spot, Ed. Look, if you had the attention of one senior defence decision maker right now in the ADF, what would you say to them?
I'm just going to go off the back of what you said, mate. I mean, at what point do you actually send young guys and girls out to do stuff to basically protect us, to give us a better life, and then when they present with some sort of injury, which is now measurable, and you close the door on them? I mean, it's just disgraceful, right? And even the stats are now telling us that more guys and girls committing suicide than actually die during war. This is ludicrous, right? So we know the problem is here. We had a Royal Commission, a report was tabled 12 months ago. There is still no action. So I would say that the resources are there. So this present, when I go speak to ADF guys, it's not uncommon for them to actually say to me when I actually have those meetings, and I'm a civvy, right? So I'm very humbled by the fact that I can go to a Queen Vic barracks and be very humbled by that. But in the same breath, the first word that's come out of their mouth when I enter the room, if you're here for money, don't start with that conversation. And it's like, sorry, I'll be here to solve the problem. Are we here on the same page? And you've got more buy-in than I have, because that guy is sitting next to you, or you've served with that guy. I don't even fit in that space. So if I can give you something that is going to improve the outcome for not only you, but your team members, then yeah, we should be talking, right?
Like I said, as a veteran and former member of the ADF, like, I'm sorry that you had to, sort of go through that, Ed, and it sort of brings me shame for the organisation that I used to work for. But having said that, with the conversations we've had over the past 5 years with people in defence, I really think it's more a case of a broken system than people not doing the right thing. There are a lot of great individuals in the ADF that are working hard, that want to solve this. But the reality is, we have a small defence force. Our staff they're overworked. I actually think they're underpaid, and they've got a lot on their plate, and they just don't have the capacity or the resources to deal with every issue that they've got on their plate. And I can guarantee you the guys responsible for addressing Royal Commission Recommendation 61 probably have about 10 other priorities that they have. They're dealing with future procurements of air defence systems, missiles, submarines, current warfighter capability, training, safety, all these different things, and how they're going to solve this issue and move forward. And so I know that it wouldn't be easy to be in their shoes. And so I guess for me, it's not a matter of sort of throwing mud at the individuals. I think it's more the organisation just hasn't been given the resources and the human power they need to solve this in the time that it needs to be solved. And I guess we're here with a message to say that you don't need to rely on people in uniform to do that. We have a team here that's been working on this for we've been working on this for more than half a decade. We've got, over a decade's experience in the ADF. You've been working at this longer than us commercially. We've got companies like Black Box Biometrics who have been working at this for almost a decade and a half, and they originally provided blast sensors to the ADF in 2012. So I think there's definitely more that we can do, and I think we are here to help the ADF. We want to solve this problem with the ADF, but at the same time, we won't survive without the money. We won't survive without the financial support. And I think it's something that if money is the only issue, I'm sure that this is something the government will support, because they've been told to support it from a Royal Commission, and I'm pretty sure that the taxpayers wouldn't mind things like this being supported. And again, our solution isn't really that expensive. It's we're talking loose change, rounding errors on the tax return, right? It's not big.
And an extension of that is as well, mate, and we don't want to bring international politics into it, right? But it's clearly been demonstrated that, our current defence minister and the government just aren't stepping up to the line. And that's, not increasing the budget spending on defence is crazy. That's not just for the toys that they play with or they use, but that's for the warfighter. And we know that if you don't have an operational warfighter or a healthy warfighter, you can have all the smart tools you like. So even though we're getting into that AI space and drones and all the rest of it, if you don't have sufficient, adequate, healthy feet on the boots on the ground, you're not going to work. So the call is also, and you give me the opportunity, I think it's to go directly to Richard Marles.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if we do not increase budget spending or use it in a way that is going to protect the warfighter and optimise the lethality of the warfighter, we're wasting time.
I do think it is a shame that we're not increasing the spend when all of Europe, all of NATO and the US is increasing their military budget. I will give the current government, I guess, some props for looking at what's happened previously and the the overspend and the pork barreling and the amount of money that was spent on sort of the big consulting firms that were being overpaid and under delivering. And I think they've done a good job at sort of cutting that fat, but that doesn't mean they don't need to spend more and solve other issues, right? But I guess when we're looking at the research, we read all these papers, and I think what's been missing, like we mentioned earlier, is connecting the dots, identifying patterns, making assumptions or hypothesis, and leveraging knowledge and practice from other disciplines to direct research where limited funds are available. And I think that's critically important when we look at, well, if we only have a little bit of money, where is the best place to spend it? And I think we've got the right team here with us and our US partners to really push the envelope forward. But when we look at blast-rated TBI, I'd like to sort of discuss and read a few things. Let's be honest, like what do we know and what don't we know, so we can work out what needs to happen moving forward. Well, we know that repetitive low-level blast exposure causes TBI. We also know that blast can be measured. We've got the B3 blast gauge, and again, a number of other sensors that can accurately measure the amount of blasts that our operators are exposed to. We know that the physiological effects can be measured. We listed a ton of them already. Everything from cognitive assessment tests to oculography, imaging, a variety of biomarkers. We also know that the physiological effects vary between individuals. And so, I think that leads us back to the point that setting a safe limit at 4 PSI or 31.7 PSI millisecond impulse, or whether everybody responds differently, that might be safe for some and not safe for others. We know that research is needed to better understand the pathology, what's actually happening at the cellular and molecular level when it comes to blast exposure. But we also know that understanding that pathology isn't needed to start measuring the effects. Do we really need to understand exactly what's happening perfectly at that cellular level if we know the response is inflammation and we can measure the inflammation? Right? Do we? I don't think so. And we know that with sufficient data, artificial intelligence, can quickly map the relationship between cause and effect, right? So if we know what they're being exposed to, we know the environmental context, we know how their performance responds with the cognitive assessment test, and we know how their brain responds with regards to neural inflammation. If we can correlate that, we can start to give them personalized recommendation and personalized medicine, right? And we also know that technology can be used now as an effective administrative control, because right now, how we administrative controlling, these safety measures. Are they doing planning and saying, hey, if this activity is going to expose them to more than 4 psi or 31.7 psi milliseconds? Simple software like Blast Buddy can track and provide those warnings and recommendations, right? But what don't we know? We actually don't know what the best physiological measurement is. We've got our hypothesis. We've seen really good results from the ITAB study with Navy SEALs exposed to blast and the neural inflammation response, right? We also don't know what the safe physiological effect limit is for a single exposure. Again, going back to that toxicology and alcohol example, right, is 0.05 or 0.07, what is that safe limit to drive? What is that safe limit, for that single exposure? And we also don't know the safe physiological limit for cumulative exposure. Again, using the alcohol analogy, right? We might know that, going over 0.05 blood alcohol concentration is not safe to drive a vehicle. But how many alcoholic beverages can you consume per night? How many nights per week? And over how many years? What's a safe amount that you can have without increasing the risk of long-term effects, right? Some say that a glass of wine 3 or 4 nights a week could be healthy, right? But binge drinking, every third weekend, probably not healthy. Having a 6-pack every night, not healthy, right? And blasts are the same. And so I think if we know what those safe single exposure limits are, what the safe cumulative limits are, then we can start to implement preventative protocols during the planning phase to prevent the injury happening before it occurs. And so, we spoke about the safety guidance really falling short of best practice. I think the research has also fallen short in identifying what is the best blast wave metric. We spoke about peak overpressure and impulse perhaps not being the best measurement, right? But what is it that we hypothesize? Well, we're hypothesizing that we can correlate blast exposure, particular blast wave metrics, to cognitive performance and neural inflammation. That's our hypothesis. We've got the tools to start measuring and getting good high quality data for research today. I spoke with a member from DSTG, quite recently, and again, we're doing much of the same. Right now, we know that the ADF is measuring blasts. They've got blast gauges on individuals, but they are not capturing the context and they're not capturing it effectively. So when they hand this data off to research, they're getting a whole bunch of blast measurements. What were they doing? Were they firing a weapon system? Were they explosive breaching? If they were explosive breaching, what was the net weight? How far away were they standing? What position were they in the stack? What was the environmental context? Was it an external breach? Were they in an alleyway? Were they within a hall? And so without capturing that high quality contextual data, precise measurements, and then routinely measuring their cognitive performance, right, I think we're not going to enable high quality research. And so, what do they say? The definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, it's sad to say, but what I see the ADF doing right now with what I've been exposed to with conversations I've had, with guys at the ground, at the coalface of doing this right now, is that they're taking the same measurements that we took 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, and expecting to magically find something new. It's not going to happen. They need a system like ours and researchers like yourself to bring all this together. We've got the team and we've got the tools. So really, there's a disconnect between the researchers and the operators. And right now, what we see is these sporadic measurements being taken without context that don't enable that high quality of research to really correlate the cause and effect. And so, look, we've talked about the blast exposure. We've talked about the injury, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the performance and how performance measurements can be a good indicator of the injury and things that we can look at with performance.
Yeah, it's a really important point to consider. Having done injury research, sports injury research for a number of years, one thing that we often end up coming back to is looking at the performance element. The injury is, which I mentioned before, something happens later. It may be an acute injury that happens at the time, or it may be a chronic or overuse injury that happens weeks or months or years later. And that's what makes it difficult to get buy-in from anyone, whether it be in a sporting situation, in a military situation, or whatever it might be. If you're talking about something that person may not see in their time in that role. But if you can talk to them about why it's important to do this thing now, because productivity is going to go down if you're talking about an office setting or an industry setting, or in a defense setting, what they'll talk about with performance is the lethality of the individual or the group. And we do know that when you're exposed to blast and you get this kind of potential injurious exposure, there's potentially a decline in your physical and cognitive ability. So if you're part of a team that's executing a mission and you've just been exposed to blast, whatever that blast may have come from, and if you're that team leader who's supposed to be the person at the front making decisions, but now you're experiencing this the effects of this blast, and maybe you can't think as clearly to make the right decisions, if you can identify that immediately and then change people, so you put your 2IC up the front, or you move people around as needed, then that's going to be an immediate outcome that keeps the performance level high and maintains the lethality for that individual and or group. And if we're not getting the answers that we want to fund the research or to back the research, because maybe the hook isn't enough with the injury element of it, then another avenue to pursue that is to understand the performance consequence of it. And that is the language that militaries around the world are using, is trying to understand immediately how can we have impact for the research that they want to fund. And as I said, if it's injuries that may be occurring 6 months, 1 year or 2 years down the track, then that may not be immediate enough for them. And these performance injuries are as real a consequence of this blast exposure as the injuries are. And if we can move people around where we think they are potentially compromising their performance and remove them from that threat, then that potentially also has a positive impact on decreasing exposure to that injurious event as well. And so that's potentially maybe where some of the conversation and language and discussions need to be had around the performance piece.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Again, it's that disconnect between the researchers and the operators. And I think what we bring here is connecting all that, because at the end of the day, maybe these safety measures will end up being based on performance, because performance might be impacted well before safety, and where milliseconds can be the difference between life or death, or identifying a friend or foe and pulling the trigger. I think it's important that we understand the performance impact, especially in high stakes environments.
And to come back to your alcohol analogy, not that we want to keep focusing on that, but the 0.05, the 0.07, 0.08, that blood alcohol volume is not based on a injury or long-term health consequence of drinking.
Yep.
It's based on performance. If you're above 0.05, your driving performance is likely impaired. Your operating of a heavy machinery is likely impaired. And so that's, so it's a good analogy that you use, because as you say, the same amount of drinks for the three of us will give us a different blood alcohol volume. But again, that isn't based on the long-term health of us from our drinking. It's based on your immediate performance to operate the vehicle.
Yep. And I guess the key thing is that, we know the research needs to be done. But when we look at how defence should solve this, right, we really want to make this safer for the operator, but without compromising capability. Because I think if there's a tangible impact on performance and capability, we need to work out a better way to do this. And that's where the disconnect that I've seen between researchers and operators has just caused so many issues, and maybe why this hasn't been pushed earlier. And you can't manage what you don't measure. And so if we look at the traditional hierarchy of controls for risk management, we've got things like elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and protective equipment. Now, it's all well and good to say, let's put suppressors on weapon systems and use blast shields, and that's great. And I agree we should be using better protective equipment so long as it's tactically effective, right? But how effective is that protective equipment? Well, we don't know because we're not measuring it. We're not measuring the cause, and we're not measuring the damage, right? So in order to validate the efficacy of those protective equipment or controls or improve safety standards, we need to start measuring. Like I said before, you cannot manage what you don't measure.
An extension of that too, mate, is obviously, the simplicity of the diagnostic as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, you don't want to be introducing things that are going to slow people down. They're going to be non-compliant. If you've got a system that's robust, that can be kept in the medic's pocket or in their backpack and apply immediately, wow, what a win, right? So again, these are where technologies need to be going. And if they're not promoting that as their solution, then they're clearly not fit for purpose, for defense purposes anyway.
No, exactly. And I think the discussions that we've had, about bridging the gap and what would an ideal solution looks like, I think this is something that the ADF and US DoD and militaries need to hear. And I think one of the first things that we need to do is sort of reframe, when we look at blast exposure. I see a lot of, whether it's the BETS survey or different surveys or different research papers, they classify a blast exposure as either being training or operational. Now, I think that's pretty poor because blast exposure doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care whether you're on operation or training. And what we look at, especially with the way that we've designed our software solution, is that the blast is either deliberate or unplanned. So if you are going to do an explosive breach in training or an operation, that's deliberate. You know you're exposing your personnel to blast. You are planning how much explosive they're going to use. You are going to recommend how far away they stand from that charge, right? And so that's very different to a soldier experiencing blast from an incoming rocket or an IED, right? And so I think reframing from deliberate and to unplanned exposures helps us sort of break down what a solution looks like and the workflows. And we really need to sort of unify the operator needs with things that are scientifically valid, but also clinically valid. And again, when we look at all these multimodal ways of, measuring performance, measuring blast, I think we've got to ask ourselves a question, is this something that the operator is going to use? Is it practical? Is it tactically effective? And is it something that we can, deploy in operations, or something that's only valid in a training environment? And I'll use oculography as an example. I don't see a world where we've got, multiple headsets worth tens of thousands of dollars doing oculography after somebody's been exposed to blast to test if they've, if they can measure any thing that might indicate a TBI. I just don't think it's practical, and I think it's very expensive, right? But what I do see is having operators, if we can time a cognitive performance test to eliminate other variabilities such as fatigue, or sleep or whatever it might be, if we get them to take a 3 or 4 minute cognitive assessment test pre-exposure, another 3 or 4 minute cognitive assessment test at the end of the day, it's simple, it's on a mobile device, tools like the Dana Brain Vital, they provide that. It's something that it can be done quite quickly and effectively and cheaply. Again, when we look at biomarkers, and when we look at the point of care device that you've developed, Ed, a Lancet pinprick blood test to measure blood and get a result in 20 minutes, that's something I can see next to every defibrillator on every defence establishment and out in the field. It's small, it's portable, and it gives you a result at the point of injury, right? And so these are things that we need to look at when we're designing a solution. The last thing we want to do is have a great new biomarker that is very effective, but you have to draw blood, control the temperature of the blood, send it off to a lab and get a result in 4 days' time. Not very practical, probably more expensive, and not something that is going to provide a tactical solution. And so when we look at the role of technology, I think I'd like to, talk about, your test, Ed, and talk about the Lancet blood test, the point of care device, and perhaps even transitioning to saliva. I'd like to unpack that.
I think the beauty of defence is, they often speak about technology and saying that we're not looking for the perfect solution. And that's made from a realistic standpoint, because if you are looking at, you're spending time, you're looking money, it's taking years to actually get to that point. Having a technology that actually is an improvement over current systems is obviously something we need to tick. And we've got that with our system. So we've got a system that improves over the current promoted biomarkers, in that it gives not only a level of injury, but a prognostic as well, and a return to duty aspect also. The other part of it is that the other multimodal measures also need to obviously marry up to some degree with what the biomarkers are actually telling us. So our biomarkers don't just sit on their own. They actually marry up with the neurocognitive. They actually say that you've got some form of pathology or something that's impacting performance. Then that marries up with the novel Dana test as well.
Yeah.
And that was where the selling point to the ADF was around a Defence Innovation Hub. When we actually first pitched to them and we spoke about health, it got a nice warm reception. It wasn't too bad. When we actually replaced health with performance, then we really got traction. So we've got a biomarker that's actually indicating performance with tick. We've got a biomarker that can be applied in a robust, dirty setting, tick. We've got a biomarker that actually can be applied and married against another measuring system when we need multimodal measures, tick. So our biomarkers and our systems really are marrying up with this complete solution. The final bit to that is, as people are developing compounds, and we need to be doing that, right? So either as a prophylactic or as a treatment mechanism post-injury, we are now married up with a number of novel compounds that actually are down-regulating that initial response. So not only are we applying a diagnostic, we've got something that marries up with another one to compound that diagnostic value, and then we've got something that marries up with an efficacy around the compound as well. That all married up into the numbers. Those numbers are all individual in essence. They get applied into a system like the Invicta system, the Blast Buddy system, and that then really ramps up, turbocharges the result, the quality of the number that's actually being produced.
I'm going to put another new idea out there, blue sky idea. So everyone's seen the recent Meta glasses that Mark Zuckerberg is going forward with. His recent partnership that he announced was Meta and Oakley. And we know Oakley are a supplier of blister glasses and goggles that are used by many military operators. Now, potentially that's another real-time oculography measurement. And, just to go back to what you said, that may not be a solution. But we've got to give the innovators a chance to show that something may or may not work. So potentially, while someone is wearing these ballistic glasses that Oakley make, if they're integrated with Meta, maybe they actually can provide real-time oculography that either is the first point that may indicate, hey, this person needs now, an in-field blood test, fingerprint blood test. Maybe the inputs from that are integrating with Blast Buddy in the field, along with the blast that maybe it's just measured, which potentially triggers an oculography reading from the glasses, from the goggles. And so potentially, that is something that gets integrated. And I think you've got to have some redundancies of measurements, but also different hierarchies of measurements, because you don't want to always have to measure everyone all the time. It's just triage in the field. So if there's a blast that's censored, if there's a blast that is sensed, then maybe there's a first level of measurement or diagnosis that's undertaken, and then for those that trigger above a certain threshold, then they are sent for further, whether it be in-field analysis or diagnosis, or maybe back at the barracks. So potentially there's several layers to real-time monitoring of the effects of blast exposure.
That's super point, right? Super point. And really, even this is where, I suppose, replicating what's happening in sport, we've got mouth guards that pick up level of impact. Do they define level of injury? Certainly not. but they're a triage tool. So they're a capture mechanism, get them to the sideline or at halftime, apply the finger stick. Similar to blast gauges that are used in defence, I think their role is to actually capture. Get data, don't try and overthink it. It's got a certain threshold they're actually hitting. That threshold might even be 1. Who knows? But it's obviously an operational number rather than a pathology number that then triages them into a finger stick and all the other applications that happen. And this is, again, where the left-hand side talking to the right, because there are studies that actually include all those things in there. But to this point, it's just a mass of data that we haven't actually farmed properly.
Oh, certainly. I actually do like the idea of the glasses, and I've seen some of the glasses that actually have a camera on them with the eye tracking. And when you analyze that footage, you can actually also see where the eyes are tracking, where the eyes are looking. So you see what the operator sees, and you see a blob on the screen that tracks where their eyes are moving. And, one of the things we were taught as operators, before you engage a threat, you're always looking at the hands. Do they have a weapon in their hands, or are they wearing a suicide vest? And so maybe we can test the reaction time between identifying, how quickly to look at the hands and how quickly to pull the trigger if there is a weapon, right? And so these are objective measures that we can have and correlate to performance, and perhaps do in real time in the future as the technology improves. So we've done an explosive breach, and the first operator goes in, he sees a weapon in the hands, pulls the trigger, and maybe his thing starts flashing orange. Hey, your reaction time's a bit slow. Get to the back of the stack, right? And so the possibilities are endless. But I absolutely love that idea. And just talking about Blast Buddy, what is it? Blast Buddy is an AI-powered software application to help operators safely plan deliberate exposures to blast. We have, really great strategic partnerships, and we integrate with the B3 blast gauge, which gives us a precise measurement of the blast wave and the Dana Brain Vital cognitive assessment test. So we can correlate that with a sensitive cognitive assessment test that's a low imposition on the end user operator. And again, both the B3 blast gauge and the Dana Brain Vital cognitive assessment test have been used in academic blast research out of the US. So they're both great validated tools, right? And then obviously working with yourself, Ed, and seeing how promising is the data from the studies, particularly with blast. For me, I think it's a no-brainer, pardon the pun, but for the ADF to use Blast Buddy as a tool that not only helps them fulfill recommendation 1 in terms of monitoring and not just measurement. So rather than just measuring the blast wave, we're also capturing the context, which is something that the US Blast Overpressure Safety Act talks about. It's the who, what, when, where, how. Our software system does that. And then we're able to correlate that, again, with the cognitive performance. And then that enables research into biomarkers. And I know that when I was serving, we would get our blood drawn sort of every 6 to 12 months to measure lead in the blood, because we were firing, that many rounds of small arms ammunition. We're at high risk of lead poisoning. Well, again, it doesn't take much extra to have that same blood sample. We're not asking them to draw extra blood. That same blood sample, let's test the biomarkers and see if we're getting results, right? And so I think we've got the knowledge, we've got the technology, and we've got the ability for the ADF to do something now, essentially out of the box, to implement safety guidance. Our software can predict and say, hey, this serial that you're planning, you're going to exceed NATO safety guidance, right? We can then package all the data up beautifully for researchers so they can see every single exposure, what the person was exposed to, what weapon system, what ammunition, how much explosive weight, how far away were they from the charge, what position is that. We can get all that, as well as marry up the cognitive performance, the cumulative load, the individual load, and then measure the biomarkers. It's not a huge task, and I think it's an undertaking that's very achievable for the ADF. And so I think this is something that there really is no more excuses in my mind. It's cost effective and it's ready to go. And again, we look at all these other solutions. There's great products out there, like the Blast Analytics and Mitigation 360, BAM 360, have a blast mat, a great training age tool, which is almost like a heat map for weapon systems that show you where the safe spots to stand. That changes behaviors, which changes the amount that people are exposed to, right? again, we spoke about the suppressors, blast shields, and all these other, protective helmets and things. We've got to measure, the impact and the damage to know how effective these safety solutions are, and we can't do that without data to enable research. So, right now we've got a tool that helps fulfill recommendation 61. We've got a tool that captures all the critical context and the blast exposure, that enables really high quality research that just hasn't been able to be done, and that nobody else is doing. Right.
I think as an extension to that, and we're all in the room together, we're ticking the boxes only not from the technology or the smarts perspective, but we've got a university that's present as well. So again, having a clinical study that's done, we're ticking boxes. We're coming to defence and we're saying we have all those boxes already covered for you. For a clinical study, we don't ask for thousands of samples or thousands of patients, right? A clinical study, if it's done right, requires a very small N number. So if defence, that's the missing piece for us, is obviously a cohort, a working cohort. So if defence can supply a small working cohort and we can design the study well, which we can do, we've got the capability of actually doing that. We've got the research and the scientific component covered by a university. We've got novel technologies. We've got an ex-operator who's at the table as well. We've got all the resources in place. All we need is the ADF to sign off, give us a very small cohort, a very small amount of time, and we can progress this technology very, very rapidly.
Oh, no, I certainly believe so. Having spoke to numerous operators all over the world, I mean, some of the things that we've been hearing are alarming, and not every country has the same, culture and the way they do things. But, I've heard shocking stories of people passing out, from explosive breaches, nosebleeds from firing heavy weapons, and this is not uncommon. And so I think we really need to have the conversation, raise awareness, help change people's behaviours, because there are behaviours we can change now that we know are just going to make a huge difference. Like if you are a planner or a team leader, I think we need to move away from planning a week of breaching, right? You're not going to limit your capability. On a week of breaching, you'll breach sort of Monday to Thursday, and Friday you'll deservice, right? And so if we're breaching 4 days in a row every month, or if you just breach 1 day a week every month, over that month period and over a 12-month period, you're having the same amount of training, so you're maintaining those skills, you're just not doing that cumulative damage, right? And so to me, it's almost like saying, do you want to go out and have 7 beers tonight, or is it safer to just have, 1 beer every night for 7 days, right? And we know that from a health perspective, it's far better to spread that load out, right?
It's basically volume prescription, right?
Yeah.
And you're the master of that, Tim. I mean, volume is the same. So this idea that you're lifting heavy weights and shorter reps, then now the science is coming out that you can lift a lot less over a higher rep load, and you're basically getting the same volume, right?
It's simple periodization from a strength and conditioning perspective.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't, if you're training for a marathon, you wouldn't necessarily do 4 30K runs back to back. You'd space those out. So that's what you're saying.
Exactly. And I guess, for us, there's been a high operator demand, and I guess we're excited to announce, and we've already put this out on social media, but we'll be launching Blast Buddy Unclassified on iOS and Android soon. The first release will just be a standalone application, which will allow operators to log their blast exposures from heavy weapons and explosive breachings. And in future releases, we'll be integrating with the next generation of the B3 blast gauge and the Dana Brain Vital Cognitive Assessment Test. But ultimately, I think the message here is that people are aware of this. People want to do something about it. And look, if your government won't protect you, Blast Buddy will. So we'll get the message out there as soon as we're on the App Store, and start monitoring this today, because you need to be aware of what you're being exposed to, and you don't want to end up with all the negative impacts of blast-related TBI. And it's not just your brain health; it's the impact to your family, to your wives, husbands, children, and the community. I think there's a lot of downstream effects. When we look at all these issues that stem from TBI, homelessness, incarceration. I mean, the list, drug and alcohol abuse, the list goes on. And I think we can stop that fairly early on just by training smarter and measuring and managing and mitigating the risks of blast exposure.
I think the other component too, mate, which is really important, is obviously the education piece, right? So having someone take control of that or do that a little bit better is also a missing piece at the moment. So looking for those resources, I know there's a lot on the internet. You've just got to be very careful on what you look for and how you define that. But I think that might be another role that we play via this group, is getting some, updated understanding, the latest research, getting it into a small package so people can actually digest that as well, because there's a lot of noise that's out there across TBI, and a lot of it's crap, to be sincerely honest.
No, certainly. And I think, I guess just from my perspective personally, I think it's exciting to see the great innovation of the minds coming out of Australia. And I mean, what are the odds that, we end up at Macquarie University Incubator, see you on television, Ed, and your background with defence and being a researcher at Macquarie University. I think we really are leading the way. We are speaking with foreign militaries. We're speaking with all the key decision makers. This combined multimodal solution that we're developing together with our US partners is really hot, and I think it's the way of the future. But I also think it's worth noting, it hasn't just been us that has called for change. We've got, Vigil Australia and Paul Scanlon, who have been incredible at advocating for change, not just here in Australia, but worldwide. I haven't seen somebody so dedicated and relentless to any cause, and he's really making waves. But more than that, he's actually connecting people and bringing people together that can make a difference. And this is on all sides of the fence. These are the innovators to the operators, to the decision makers, to the policy makers, and the work that he has done in advocating for change. And pushing the Royal Commission to recognise blast exposure as being a significant contributing factor to defence and veteran suicide. I think my hat goes off to Paul, and thank you, Paul, for all your hard work. And I just think I'm just very proud to be Australian with us sitting here and yourself, Paul, and the work that we're doing and leading the way globally. And I think it's also worth mentioning the Navy Clearance Diver Trust has also been very supportive, and the Commando Welfare Trust being very supportive, again, in advocating for change to the Royal Commission and help getting recommendation 61 across the line.
I think as an extension of that as well, silo mentalities hasn't worked. It hasn't worked across other pathologies. Why should it work for TBI, right? So I think opening up the doors to collaboration is an important one. And that's something that has really been lacking up until this point. I mean, you've still got people within this particular precinct who really aren't talking to each other when they really should be. So I think that's an important one. We've got to put the patient, the operator, whoever it is, the child, whoever first, and then work backwards from that.
No, certainly. We've known about the risk of blast exposure for years, and we've buried too many of our mates, not just in Australia, but within the global military community. And still, we wait. Legislative and policy reform is happening across the globe, with the US Blast Overpressure Safety Act and recent NATO guidance. And still, we wait. The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide has called for action to better understand and mitigate the effects of repetitive low-level blast exposure. That was almost a year ago, and still, we wait. We don't need to wait for more casualties or another inquiry. The science exists, the tools exist, and the team exists. And we're ready to move today. This is no longer a question of awareness, it's a question of will. What are we waiting for? There is a moral obligation to act. Not next year, not after the next funeral, but now. If you're in a position to support, fund, champion, or simply just share this message, then do it. Because protecting brains, preserving lives, and safeguarding our capability isn't just good policy, it's the right thing to do.